April 29th, 1945. The war in Europe had 6 days left to live, though the Wehrmacht soldiers huddled in the Bavarian forest didn't know it yet. They knew only that their world was collapsing, that American armies were sweeping through southern Germany like a spring flood, and that every hour brought fresh rumours of surrender, suicide and chaos. In a clearing near the town of Kitzingen, approximately 10,000 German soldiers of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, Gotz von Berlichingen, had gathered in a state of confused limbo. Their officers had abandoned them, their supply lines had evaporated, their communications had ceased. They were armed, organised and technically still at war, but they were an army without purpose, waiting for someone to tell them what happened next. What happened next was a single American jeep. The story of how one vehicle and a handful of American soldiers accepted the surrender of an entire German division is not just a tale of military absurdity. It's a window into the complete psychological and material collapse of the Wehrmacht in the final weeks of World War II, a demonstration of how thoroughly the German military had been broken by years of attrition, and a reminder that wars often end not with climactic battles, but with exhausted men simply giving up. To understand how something this improbable could occur, we need to understand what had happened to the German army by late April 1945, and why thousands of armed soldiers would surrender to a force that couldn't possibly contain them. The 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division had been formed in October 1943, named after Gotz von Berlichingen, a 16th century German knight famous for his iron prosthetic hand and his robust language. The division saw its first action in France in 1944, where it fought against the Allied invasion with the fanatical intensity expected of SS units. But by April 1945, the division was a shadow of its former strength. Months of continuous combat, overwhelming Allied air superiority, fuel shortages, and catastrophic casualties had reduced it from a mechanized force of 20,000 men to a ragged collection of survivors barely holding together. As American forces swept across southern Germany in April 1945, the strategic situation for German units became hopeless. The Rhine had been crossed in multiple places. The Ruhr pocket had been eliminated, costing Germany 300,000 prisoners. Soviet armies were fighting in the streets of Berlin. The Italian front was collapsing. There was no reinforcement, no resupply, no strategic reserve, and most importantly, no hope. German soldiers faced an impossible choice. Continue fighting for a regime that was obviously finished, surrender to the Western Allies and hope for decent treatment, or flee east and pray they could evade the Soviet advance. For the men of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, the choice was complicated by their SS status. Unlike regular Wehrmacht soldiers, SS troops feared they would be treated as war criminals by the Allies. This wasn't entirely paranoid. SS units had been involved in numerous atrocities throughout the war, and while not every SS soldier was guilty of war crimes, the organization's reputation was thoroughly blackened. Many SS men believed surrender meant execution. This fear kept some units fighting long after rational military logic dictated capitulation. By late April 1945, the division had been pushed into the area around Kitzingen in northern Bavaria. The town sits along the Main River, about 30 miles southeast of Würzburg. The surrounding countryside is rolling farmland and forest, beautiful in peacetime but offering limited defensive terrain. The division's remnants, perhaps 10,000 men, had congregated in the forest northeast of the town, not because they had orders to defend the position, but because they had nowhere else to go. Their commanding officers had either been killed, wounded, or had simply disappeared as the command structure disintegrated. The Americans advancing through this sector were elements of the 12th Armoured Division, part of the 7th Army. The 12th Armoured had landed in France in November 1944 and had fought continuously through the winter and spring, participating in the reduction of the Colmar pocket and the drive into southern Germany. By late April, they were moving fast, exploiting the collapse of German resistance and racing to secure territory before the war ended. They were encountering German units that were surrendering en masse, sometimes entire battalions giving up without a fight. On April 29th, a reconnaissance patrol from the 12th Armoured Division was probing the roads northeast of Kitzingen. The patrol consisted of a single jeep carrying 4 men. Technical Sergeant Charles Havlat from Illinois, Private First Class James Dorris from Texas, Private First Class Robert McCauley from Ohio, and their driver, whose name has been lost to history, but who was later identified in some accounts as Private First Class William Prosser. They were not an assault force. They were not expecting combat. They were simply checking roads and villages to determine where German forces might be located so that larger American units could plan their movements. The Jeep was equipped as standard for reconnaissance work, a pedestal-mounted Browning .30 caliber machine gun, a radio that may or may not have been working reliably, maps, binoculars, and the personal weapons of the crew, M1 Garand rifles and M1911 pistols. Against determined resistance, a single Jeep was effectively defenseless. Its thin metal body offered no protection against small arms fire. Its mobility was its only real asset, the ability to speed away from danger before the enemy could react. As the Jeep moved along a forest road northeast of Kitzingen, the crew began noticing signs of German presence. Fresh vehicle tracks, discarded equipment, the smell of wood smoke from cooking fires. They proceeded cautiously, aware that they might be driving into a German position but needing to gather intelligence about enemy dispositions. What they found defied their expectations and their experience. As the road curved through a dense section of forest, they encountered the first German soldiers, not a small patrol or a rear guard, but dozens of men in field grey uniforms standing along the roadside, watching the Jeep approach with expressions that combined fear, exhaustion, and resignation. Sergeant Havlet, commanding the patrol, made an instant decision that required either remarkable courage or remarkable foolishness. Instead of retreating, he ordered the Jeep to stop. The crew dismounted, bringing their weapons to ready positions, and Havlat approached the German soldiers. In broken German, supplemented by hand gestures, he demanded to know where their officers were. The German soldiers, rather than opening fire or attempting to capture the Americans, pointed deeper into the forest. They wanted to surrender, but they needed permission from their commanders to do so. What Havlet and his crew had stumbled into was a military formation in a state of psychological collapse. The German soldiers gathered in these forests were not cowards or shirkers. Many were veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had survived Stalingrad, Kursk, and the long retreat through Russia. They had fought with skill and determination for years, but by April 1945 they were utterly defeated in spirit. They had no illusions about Germany winning the war. They had no faith in Nazi promises of wonder weapons or miracle victories. They wanted only to survive the war's final days and return home. The SS designation complicated matters. These men knew that being captured wearing SS runes carried risks. American soldiers had heard about concentration camps. They had seen the evidence of SS atrocities. The possibility of summary execution was real, yet continuing to fight was pointless. The war was over in all but official declaration. Every day spent in combat was another chance to die for nothing. The German soldiers were trapped between fear of surrender and futility of resistance, waiting for someone to make the decision for them. Sergeant Havlet made a calculation. He was looking at hundreds, perhaps thousands, of German soldiers who apparently wanted to surrender. His jeep carried 4 men with small arms. In any rational military engagement, the Americans would be captured or killed within minutes if the Germans chose to fight. But Havlet recognized that the Germans didn't want to fight. They wanted legitimacy for their surrender. They needed an authority figure to accept their capitulation so they could tell themselves they had obeyed orders until the end. Following the directions given by the German soldiers, the jeep proceeded deeper into the forest. What the Americans found was astounding. A massive encampment of German troops spread through the woods, soldiers sitting around fires, vehicles parked, under camouflage, artillery pieces with their barrels pointed at the sky, stacks of weapons and equipment. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 German soldiers of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division were gathered in this forest, organized by units, maintaining military discipline and waiting. The jeep reached what appeared to be a command post, marked by radio vehicles and staff officers. Here, Havlet encountered the senior German officer present, whose identity remains disputed in historical accounts. Some sources identify him as Standartenführer Hans Lingner. Others suggest it was Obersturmbannführer Walter Dressler. The confusion reflects the chaos of German command structure in the war's final days, where rank and authority had become fluid concepts. What matters is that this officer represented whatever command structure remained in the division. Through an interpreter, either a German soldier who spoke English or an American who spoke German, the negotiation began. The German officer explained the situation. His division had been ordered to defend this sector, but those orders had come from a headquarters that no longer existed. His men were out of fuel, low on ammunition, and cut off from supply. American forces surrounded them. Continuing resistance would accomplish nothing except getting his men killed. He wanted to surrender the entire division, but he needed assurance that his men would be treated according to the Geneva Convention and not executed as SS troops. Sergeant Havlat, a non-commissioned officer with no authority to accept surrender of an entire division, made a command decision that exceeded his rank by several levels. He agreed to accept the surrender. He promised the Germans would be treated as prisoners of war, not war criminals, though he had no authority to make such guarantees. He instructed the German officer to have his men assemble in designated areas with their weapons stacked and to prepare for American forces to take custody of them. The German officer agreed. The absurdity of the situation was apparent to everyone involved. A single jeep with 4 American soldiers had just accepted surrender of 10,000 German troops. The Americans couldn't guard these prisoners, they couldn't transport them, they couldn't even count them accurately. If the Germans changed their minds, if a fanatical Nazi officer decided to resist, if younger soldiers decided to fight their way out, the Americans would be instantly overwhelmed. The entire arrangement depended on mutual agreement that the war was over, and continuation of combat served no purpose. Havlat radioed his headquarters to report the situation. The initial response was disbelief. A single reconnaissance patrol had taken surrender of an entire division. The report must be exaggerated. Perhaps they had encountered a company that wanted to surrender, or a battalion at most. But as Havlat insisted on the accuracy of his report and described what he was seeing, the American command realized they had a situation requiring immediate attention. Within hours, elements of the 12th Armoured Division were rushing toward the forest. Combat units were diverted to secure the surrendering Germans. Military police was summoned to process prisoners. Intelligence officers were dispatched to interrogate German personnel and secure documents. The machinery of the American military, designed for combat, shifted to handle the unexpected task of accepting mass surrender. The German soldiers, true to the agreement, remained in their positions. They stacked their rifles in neat pyramids as Wehrmacht regulations prescribed. They surrendered their pistols, their grenades, their Panzerfausts. Officers retained their sidearms initially, as military protocol suggested, though these would be confiscated later during processing. The men waited with the patience of those who have survived years of war and can wait a few more hours to officially become prisoners. As American forces arrived in strength, the magnitude of what had occurred became clear. This wasn't just a large surrender. It was the capitulation of a formation that still possessed significant combat power. The Germans had ammunition, though not abundant. They had artillery pieces, though little fuel to move them. They had small arms, machine guns, Panzerfausts, and most importantly, they had organisation. A determined defence by 10,000 troops in forested terrain could have delayed the American advance for days and inflicted significant casualties. Instead, they had surrendered to 4 men in a jeep. The processing of prisoners took several days. The Germans were marched under guard to collection points, where they were searched, documented, and segregated by rank. Officers were separated from enlisted men. SS personnel were identified and separated for additional interrogation. Medical personnel treated wounded on both sides. The Americans provided rations, as many German soldiers hadn't eaten properly in days. Water was distributed. The basic human needs of 10,000 prisoners demanded immediate attention. Among the German prisoners were men with extraordinary combat experience. Veterans who had fought at Stalingrad, at Kursk, in Normandy, in the Battle of the Bulge. Men who had earned Iron Crosses and Knight's Crosses for valour. Soldiers who had survived battles that destroyed entire armies, yet they had surrendered without firing a shot because they recognised the fundamental reality that ideology cannot overcome material exhaustion and strategic hopelessness. The Nazi regime had demanded they fight to the death. Instead, they chose life as prisoners over death for a defeated cause. The American soldiers processing these prisoners were struck by their condition. Many Germans were teenagers, boys of 16 or 17, who had been conscripted in the war's final months. Others were men in their 40s and 50s, veterans of the First World War recalled to service as Germany's manpower pool evaporated. Their uniforms were threadbare, their boots were falling apart, they showed signs of malnutrition and exhaustion. These were not the supermen of Nazi propaganda, they were defeated soldiers who wanted the war to end. The intelligence gathered from the surrendered division provided valuable information about the collapse of German military organization. Interrogations revealed that many units had received no orders for weeks. Supply had ceased. Pay had stopped. The vaunted German military efficiency had disintegrated into chaos. Officers described receiving contradictory orders from multiple headquarters, none of which had authority or information. The Wehrmacht's command structure, once the envy of military professionals worldwide, had become a fiction, maintained only by habit and discipline. One particularly revealing interrogation involved a German captain who had commanded a company in the division. He explained that his men had discussed their options for several days before the American jeep arrived. Some wanted to surrender immediately, others wanted to flee and try to reach their homes before being captured. A few, mostly young fanatics, wanted to fight to the death as Nazi propaganda demanded. The arrival of the Americans resolved the debate. Once an authority figure appeared to accept their surrender, even an authority as minimal as a sergeant in a jeep, the psychological barrier to capitulation disappeared. They could surrender with honor because they had been defeated by superior force, even if that superior force consisted of 4 men. The story of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division's surrender spread quickly through both American and German forces. For Americans, it became a tale illustrating how thoroughly Germany was defeated. The Wehrmacht, once considered the finest military machine in history, had collapsed so completely that entire divisions surrendered to patrols. For German soldiers in other units, it provided a model for how to end their war. Surrender was possible. The Americans were accepting prisoners. Treatment appeared to follow Geneva Convention rules. Word spread through remaining German units that capitulation was preferable to pointless death. In the final week of the war, mass surrenders became common. German units that still possessed combat capability chose imprisonment over destruction. The 11th Panzer Division surrendered intact to American forces. The remains of Army Group G, over 100,000 men, surrendered in Bavaria. In northern Germany, entire corps laid down their weapons. The psychological dam had broken. German soldiers no longer believed in victory or even honourable defeat. They wanted only to survive and go home. The treatment of the surrendered SS division created complications that extended beyond the immediate military situation. The SS designation meant these men were potentially subject to war crimes investigations. The 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division had been involved in several atrocities during its service in France, including the massacre of civilians at Toul and the hanging of 99 men in retaliation for resistance activities. Individual soldiers might be innocent, but the unit's record was damning. American authorities faced a dilemma. They had promised these men treatment as prisoners of war, but investigation might reveal war criminals among the surrendered soldiers. The solution was bureaucratic. All prisoners were treated according to Geneva Convention initially. During processing, soldiers were questioned about their service. Those identified as potentially involved in atrocities were segregated for war crimes investigation. Most German soldiers, having served in combat roles rather than security or anti-partisan operations, were cleared. Some officers and NCOs faced tribunals. A few were prosecuted and convicted. The broader significance of this surrender extends beyond the immediate military facts. It illustrates how armies collapse not through defeat in battle, but through psychological exhaustion. The German soldiers in that forest had not been destroyed in combat. They had chosen to stop fighting because continuation served no purpose. This choice, repeated across Germany in April and May 1945, ended the war in Europe as surely as any battle. The Wehrmacht's disintegration revealed truths about military power that are often obscured by focus on tactics and technology. Armies fight effectively when soldiers believe in their cause, trust their leaders, and see possibility of victory. Remove these elements and military organization crumbles regardless of weapons or training. The German soldiers who surrendered to Sergeant Havlet's jeep had lost faith in all three. They no longer believed in Nazi ideology, if they ever had. They no longer trusted leaders who had led Germany to catastrophic defeat. They saw no possibility that continued fighting would produce anything but their deaths. The American ability to handle mass surrenders demonstrated the material superiority that had doomed Germany. The logistics of feeding, housing, guarding, and processing hundreds of thousands of prisoners was enormous. Yet American forces managed it efficiently, while maintaining offensive operations. They had enough trucks to transport prisoners, enough food to feed them, enough guards to secure them, and enough administrative personnel to process them. Germany, by contrast, couldn't supply its fighting units, let alone handle prisoners. The comparison illustrated why Germany lost the war. Sergeant Charles Havlett received the Bronze Star for his actions on April 29, 1945. The citation praised his courage and initiative in accepting surrender of enemy forces far superior in number. He returned to Illinois after the war and lived quietly, rarely discussing his role in one of the war's more unusual episodes. In interviews decades later, he emphasized that he didn't capture the German division. They captured themselves. His role was simply to be present when they decided to surrender. The German officer who negotiated the surrender, whether Lingner or Dressler, survived the war and was held in prisoner of war camps until 1947. Like many German officers, he wrote a memoir that attempted to explain how Germany had been defeated. His account emphasized material factors, American numerical superiority, air power, logistics, while downplaying German mistakes and Nazi criminality. It was a common narrative among German veterans, shifting blame from themselves to circumstances beyond their control. The forest where 10,000 German soldiers surrendered to 4 Americans is now peaceful farmland and timber lots. No monument marks the location. Most residents of modern Kitzingen are unaware that one of the war's most unusual surrenders occurred nearby. History moves on, and incidents that seemed momentous to participants fade into footnotes, yet the story endures because it captures something essential about war's end. Conflicts terminate not always through climactic battles, but through exhaustion, demoralization, and recognition that continuation brings only suffering. The German soldiers in that Bavarian forest understood this. They were defeated not by the 4 Americans in the jeep, but by 4 years of war that had destroyed their army, their country, and their future. Surrender to a jeep was simply the final admission of reality they had been avoiding. The broader context makes the story even more striking. While these 10,000 Germans surrendered without resistance, Berlin was experiencing its death agony. Hitler was in his bunker ordering non-existent armies to counterattack. SS units were executing soldiers for cowardice or defeatism. Goebbels was broadcasting propaganda about final victory. Yet in Bavaria, an entire SS division chose surrender over sacrifice, pragmatism over propaganda, life over death in service to a failed cause. This disconnect between Nazi leadership's fanaticism and ordinary soldiers' war weariness characterized Germany's final weeks. The regime demanded resistance to the death. Most soldiers chose surrender and survival. The gap between ideology and reality had become unbridgeable. German soldiers could see American armies, American aircraft, American supplies everywhere. They could see their own situation deteriorating daily. Propaganda about wonder weapons and miracle victories convinced no one who had eyes to see the truth. The American soldiers who accepted these surrenders were often surprised by how willingly Germans capitulated. Many Americans had been taught that Germans were fanatical Nazis who would fight to the last man. Reality was more complex. Some Germans were indeed fanatics who fought until killed, but most were ordinary men conscripted into a war they didn't start, fighting for a cause they didn't believe in, wanting only to survive and go home. When opportunity arose to surrender honourably, they took it. The Jeep Patrol's experience became a teaching moment for military intelligence. Analysts studied why the Germans surrendered so readily. They concluded that several factors had combined to produce mass capitulation: material exhaustion, lack of supplies, fuel, ammunition, psychological defeat, recognition that Germany had lost the war. Fear of Soviet capture. Many Germans preferred American imprisonment to Soviet revenge. Breakdown of command authority. Without orders or leadership, soldiers made their own decisions. And finally, the presence of a legitimate authority to accept surrender, even authority as minimal as an American sergeant. This last factor was particularly important. Military cultures emphasize obedience to authority and following orders. German military culture especially stressed discipline and hierarchy. Soldiers who had been trained to obey couldn't simply walk away from their posts. They needed someone with authority to officially release them from duty. The American patrol, however minimal its actual power, represented legitimate authority. By surrendering to properly uniformed American soldiers, Germans could tell themselves they had followed military protocol and surrendered honorably to superior force. The psychological aspects of surrender fascinated military psychiatrists who studied prisoner behavior. They found that soldiers often needed permission to quit fighting. Surrender required overcoming powerful social and cultural pressures. Fear of being labelled coward, loyalty to comrades, military discipline, ideological conditioning all pushed soldiers toward continued resistance. Surrender required excuse or justification that allowed men to quit without losing self-respect. Being outnumbered provided that excuse. The Germans in the forest weren't cowards. They had been overwhelmed by superior force. The fact that superior force consisted of 4 men in a jeep was beside the point. The post-war fate of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division soldiers varied. Most were held in prisoner of war camps for 1 to 2 years, then repatriated to Germany. They returned to a country that no longer existed as they had known it. Germany was divided, occupied, its cities in ruins. The Nazi regime that had demanded their service was extinct. Many former soldiers struggled to adapt to civilian life, carrying psychological scars from years of combat. Some prospered in the Wirtschaftswunder, West Germany's economic miracle. Others never fully recovered from their war experiences. A few soldiers from the division faced war crimes charges related to atrocities in France. The trials revealed that some SS units had committed systematic murders of civilians and prisoners. These revelations complicated the post-war narrative that ordinary German soldiers had fought honourably, and that only Nazi leadership was guilty of crimes. The truth was murkier. Most soldiers hadn't personally committed atrocities, but many had been complicit or aware. The moral accounting of Germany's defeat extended beyond military matters into questions of collective guilt and individual responsibility. Sergeant Havlet never claimed to be a hero. In his view, he had simply done his job. He had been sent to gather intelligence about enemy positions. He had found Germans who wanted to surrender. He had facilitated that surrender and called for support. That his report turned into one of the war's largest single-day capitulations was more a function of German demoralization than American military prowess. He was right, but his modesty understates the courage required to confront thousands of enemy soldiers with nothing but a jeep and determination. The incident raises interesting counterfactuals. What if the German division had been commanded by fanatical Nazis determined to fight to the death? What if younger soldiers had refused to surrender and opened fire on the jeep? What if the Germans had been better supplied and still believed victory possible? In any of these scenarios, 4 Americans in a jeep would have been killed or captured instantly. The mass surrender happened because of circumstances, timing, and the specific psychological state of the German soldiers involved. This highlights warfare's contingent nature. History remembers great battles, brilliant tactics, technological innovations. But wars are decided as much by logistics, morale, psychology, and countless small decisions by ordinary people. The choice of 10,000 German soldiers to surrender rather than fight affected the war's outcome more than many larger battles. It removed a division from German order of battle, freed American forces for other missions, and demonstrated to remaining German units that surrender was acceptable. The story also illustrates the American military's ability to improvise and adapt. Sergeant Havlet wasn't following a doctrine for accepting mass surrenders. No training manual covered what to do when you encounter an entire enemy division that wants to quit. He made decisions in real time based on his assessment of the situation. This flexibility and initiative was characteristic of American military culture, which encouraged non-commissioned officers to exercise judgment and take responsibility. German military culture, more rigid and hierarchical, often struggled when formal command structures broke down. Finally, the surrender demonstrates how wars end when exhaustion overcomes ideology. The Nazi regime promised Germans victory or death, total war and final triumph. Reality delivered defeat, destruction, and exhaustion. When given the choice between dying for a lost cause and surviving as prisoners, most German soldiers chose survival. This choice was rational, human, and ultimately inevitable once Germany's defeat became apparent. The end came 6 days after the forest surrender. On May 8, 1945, Germany signed unconditional surrender documents. World War II in Europe officially ended. The 10,000 German soldiers who had surrendered to a jeep were already prisoners. Their war finished before the formal conclusion. In that sense, Sergeant Havlett's patrol had been present at the beginning of the end, the moment when German soldiers stopped fighting and acknowledged defeat. 70 years later, historians examining the war's final weeks have identified the mass surrenders of April and May 1945 as crucial to limiting casualties in the conflict's last days. If German units had fought fanatically to the end, tens of thousands more soldiers and civilians would have died in pointless combat. Instead, pragmatism prevailed. Soldiers chose survival. Officers accepted reality. The war ended not with Wagnerian apocalypse, but with exhausted men stacking rifles and walking into imprisonment. The jeep that accepted surrender of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division was not preserved. It was a standard Willys MB, one of 640,000 produced during the war. After its moment of historical significance, it returned to mundane military transport duties, carrying officers, mail, supplies, and wounded soldiers. Eventually it was scrapped or sold as surplus, its role in accepting surrender of 10,000 enemy soldiers unknown to whoever pushed it into a junkyard crusher. But the story survives in military histories, veteran memoirs, and oral traditions of the units involved. It's taught at military schools as an example of how wars really end, not through dramatic last stands but through exhausted surrender. It's remembered in Kitzingen, though imperfectly, as one of many strange incidents in that region's long history, and it's recalled by historians as evidence of how thoroughly Germany was defeated by May 1945, so beaten that divisions surrendered to patrols. The ultimate lesson is about the limits of military force divorced from sustainable political purpose. German soldiers in 1939 had been confident, well-equipped, tactically superior, and convinced of their cause. By 1945 they had none of these advantages. Years of attrition, material exhaustion, strategic failure, and moral bankruptcy had transformed the Wehrmacht from conqueror to victim. No amount of individual courage or tactical skill could overcome these fundamental deficiencies. When 10,000 armed soldiers surrender to 4 enemies, it signals not a single defeat but comprehensive system collapse. Sergeant Havlett's Jeep Patrol happened to be present when that collapse became undeniable. They didn't force the surrender through combat prowess. They provided the excuse German soldiers needed to stop fighting. In doing so, they participated in a moment that symbolized how the most terrible war in human history finally ended not with nuclear fire or apocalyptic battle, but with exhausted men choosing to go home. The German soldiers who surrendered that day came from varied backgrounds that reflected Germany's desperate final mobilization. Among them were veterans of the Eastern Front who had survived the meat grinder of the Eastern campaigns, men who had seen horrors that would haunt them for decades. There were also Volkssturm conscripts, grandfathers and teenagers pressed into service during Germany's final desperate months. Factory workers from the Ruhr who had been soldiers for mere weeks stood alongside professional soldiers who had served since the invasion of Poland in 1939. The division's history traced back to October 1943, when it was formed in France from various SS units and replacements. Unlike the elite Waffen-SS divisions that received priority for equipment and recruitment, the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division was always a second-tier formation, equipped with captured French and Czech vehicles, old German equipment, and whatever could be scraped together from depots. Its soldiers were not the racial elite of Nazi propaganda, but a mixture of ethnic Germans, Volksdeutsche from occupied territories, and even some involuntary conscripts from annexed regions. The division's combat record in France during 1944 had been marked by both conventional military action and war crimes. During the fighting in Normandy, elements of the division participated in operations against French resistance fighters that crossed the line from counterinsurgency into atrocity. The hanging of 99 men at Toul on June 9, 1944, was ordered by division officers in retaliation for resistance attacks. The victims were selected arbitrarily from the male population, many with no connection to the resistance whatsoever. This action, and others like it, would ensure that the division's name remained associated with Nazi criminality long after the war ended. By the time the division retreated into Bavaria in April 1945, it bore little resemblance to the formation that had fought in Normandy. Casualties, desertions, and the general disintegration of German military organisation had reduced it to perhaps half its authorised strength. The mechanised element that gave Panzer Grenadier divisions their mobility and firepower had largely evaporated. Vehicles were abandoned for lack of fuel. Artillery pieces were spiked and left behind. Heavy weapons were dumped because there was no ammunition, or no means to transport them. What remained was essentially a large group of infantrymen with small arms, organised into companies and battalions more from habit than military necessity. They moved at night to avoid Allied aircraft that dominated the skies. They foraged for food from farms and villages, sometimes paying with worthless Reichsmarks, sometimes simply taking what they needed. They avoided contact with American forces when possible, knowing that every engagement could only end in defeat or death. The officers commanding these remnants faced impossible decisions. Their oath of loyalty bound them to the Führer and the Nazi state. Military tradition demanded they fight until ordered to surrender by proper authority. But proper authority had ceased to exist. Hitler was isolated in Berlin, issuing orders to armies that no longer existed. Army Group headquarters had lost contact with subordinate units. Division commanders couldn't reach regimental commanders. The command chain had snapped at every level. Some German officers in the war's final weeks chose suicide rather than face defeat. Others simply walked away, discarding their uniforms and attempting to disappear into the civilian population. A few fanatical Nazis organised last-ditch defensive positions and fought until killed or overwhelmed. But many officers, confronted with the reality that continued resistance would only kill their men for no purpose, looked for opportunities to arrange surrender on the best possible terms. The officer commanding the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, remnants in the forest near Kitzingen, was in this last category. He faced the additional complication of his SS status. Surrendering to the Soviets was unthinkable. Soviet treatment of SS prisoners was summary execution more often than imprisonment. Surrendering to the Americans or British offered better prospects, but there was still fear that SS designation meant war crimes prosecution regardless of individual guilt. This officer, whether Lingner or Dressler, had likely discussed options with his subordinate commanders. They knew the Americans were approaching from the west. They knew the war was effectively over. Radio intercepts and the rumour mill that operates in all armies had told them that Hitler was dead or dying, that Berlin was falling, that other German units were surrendering en masse. The question was not whether to surrender, but how to do so in a way that maximised their chances of survival and minimised casualties. The appearance of Sergeant Havlet's jeep provided the opportunity they needed. Here was official American military authority, however minimal. By surrendering to uniformed American soldiers, the German officers could claim they had been defeated by legitimate military force, rather than simply abandoning their posts. This distinction mattered psychologically and legally. It allowed them to maintain the fiction that they had served honourably until properly defeated, rather than admitting they had quit because the cause was hopeless. The negotiation between Havlet and the German commander was necessarily brief and conducted through improvised translation. Neither side had prepared for this situation. There was no protocol for a sergeant accepting divisional surrender. There were no proper documents to sign, no formal ceremony. The German officer essentially gave his word that his troops would remain in place and surrender their weapons. Havlat gave his word that American forces would arrive to take custody of the prisoners and that they would receive treatment according to international law. Both men were making promises they weren't entirely certain they could keep. Havlat had no authority to guarantee anything beyond his personal intention to follow Geneva Convention rules. The German officer couldn't be certain all his troops would obey surrender orders, particularly younger fanatics who had been indoctrinated to fight to the death. But both men understood that this improvised agreement was better than the alternatives. Combat would kill men on both sides for no strategic gain. Allowing the German force to disperse would create security problems and potential guerrilla resistance. As Havlat radioed his report to headquarters, he was aware of how extraordinary his situation was. He could see German soldiers everywhere in the forest, hundreds visible from his position, thousands more implied by the extent of the encampment. Any of them could have killed him with ease. His survival depended entirely on German willingness to honour the surrender agreement. If even a small group decided to resist or take the Americans hostage, there was nothing Havlet and his 3 companions could do to stop them. The German soldiers, for their part, watched the Americans with mixture of curiosity and relief. Many had expected Americans to be brutal conquerors, a mirror image of how German forces had behaved in occupied territories. Nazi propaganda had portrayed Americans as gangster-like soldiers, interested only in plunder and rape. the reality of professional disciplined American troops accepting surrender, according to military protocol, contradicted years of indoctrination. As word spread through the German encampment that surrender had been arranged, reactions varied. Older veterans, men who had survived years of Eastern Front combat, expressed relief that their war was finally over. Middle-aged family men thought about getting home to see what remained of their families and communities. Younger soldiers, particularly those who had joined the SS voluntarily and believed Nazi ideology, struggled with cognitive dissonance. They had been promised glory and victory. Instead, they were surrendering to a jeep patrol. Some German soldiers wept. Some laughed with dark humour at the absurdity. Some simply stared into space, emotionally exhausted beyond reaction. The psychological toll of years of war, of watching comrades die, of participating in or witnessing atrocities, of believing promises that proved false, had left many men emotionally hollowed out. Surrender was just another event in a cascade of disasters that had become their normal experience. Within 2 hours of Havlet's radio call, the first American reinforcements arrived. An armoured car and several trucks carrying infantry established a perimeter around the German position. More forces followed, company-strength elements that began the process of actually securing 10,000 prisoners. Military police arrived with clipboards and forms to begin documentation. Intelligence officers came to interrogate prisoners and secure any valuable information about German dispositions or capabilities. The physical process of accepting surrender was chaotic but methodical. German soldiers were instructed to form into their existing units and march to designated collection points. Officers were separated immediately to prevent any organised resistance. Weapons were collected and stacked in piles that grew into small mountains of rifles, machine guns, Panzerfausts and grenades. Personal items were searched for contraband, weapons or intelligence materials. Each prisoner was given a cursory medical examination, a necessity given that many showed signs of malnutrition or untreated wounds. The Americans were struck by the physical condition of their prisoners. These were supposed to be elite SS troops, yet many looked like scarecrows in uniform. Uniforms were patched and threadbare. Boots were held together with wire and rags. Many men showed signs of vitamin deficiency, with bleeding gums and skin problems. This was the mighty Wehrmacht that had conquered most of Europe. These exhausted, malnourished men in ragged uniforms. The contrast with American forces was stark. American soldiers were well fed, well equipped, and well supplied. Their uniforms were intact, their boots solid, their equipment functional. They had cigarettes to smoke, chocolate to share, and the confidence of men whose nation's industrial power was overwhelming. The material superiority that had doomed Germany was visible in the simple comparison between captor and captive. Food became the immediate concern. The German soldiers hadn't eaten properly in days. American quartermasters, accustomed to feeding their own troops with abundance, suddenly faced the challenge of feeding 10,000 additional men. Field kitchens were established. Rations were distributed. The irony was not lost on anyone that former enemies were now dependent on American generosity for survival. Some German soldiers, receiving their first substantial meal in days, ate until they became sick, their shrunken stomachs unable to handle normal food quantities. Medical treatment highlighted the disparity in resources. American medics treated German wounded with the same drugs and techniques used for American casualties. Sulfur drugs, morphine, plasma, antibiotics, all products of American pharmaceutical industry, were used to treat men who had been trying to kill Americans days earlier. German soldiers who had fought in the East described Soviet medical care as primitive or non-existent. American medicine seemed almost miraculous by comparison. The interrogation process revealed the full extent of German military collapse. Intelligence officers questioned German soldiers about their units, their equipment, their orders, and their knowledge of other German forces. What emerged was a picture of comprehensive disintegration. Communications had failed, supply lines had ceased, command authority had evaporated. Many soldiers hadn't been paid in months. Some hadn't received mail from home since the previous year. They had been fighting on momentum and habit, following orders from officers who themselves had no clear direction. One interrogation proved particularly revealing. A German captain, a decorated veteran of campaigns in Poland, France, Russia, and Normandy, explained his decision to support surrender. He described watching the Luftwaffe disappear from German skies, replaced by overwhelming Allied air power. He talked about receiving orders to defend positions with ammunition counted in rounds per rifle, rather than crates per company. He mentioned watching young recruits, boys of 16 with a few weeks' training, sent into combat against veteran American units. The conclusion was obvious. Germany had lost the war. Continuing to fight was murder of your own men. This captain's testimony reflected the thoughts of many German officers in April 1945. They were not cowards. They had proven their courage in years of combat. But they were realists who could see that Germany's situation was hopeless. The Nazi leadership's demand to fight until the last man was a death cult fantasy, not a military strategy. These officers chose to save their men's lives rather than sacrifice them for a regime that was already dead. The ideological indoctrination that had sustained German forces through years of war had collapsed along with everything else. Nazi propaganda had promised final victory through wonder weapons, through superior will, through racial destiny. But reality had delivered defeat after defeat, destruction of German cities and Allied armies on German soil. Even true believers struggled to maintain faith when evidence contradicted every promise. Younger soldiers, products of Hitler Youth indoctrination, were more likely to express continued faith in Nazi ideology, even as they surrendered. They spoke of temporary setbacks, of secret weapons that would turn the tide, of the Führer's genius that would deliver victory. American interrogators found these young fanatics both pathetic and dangerous. Pathetic because they clung to obviously false beliefs, dangerous because their fanaticism might inspire continued resistance. The SS designation complicated prisoner processing. American forces had standing orders to identify SS personnel and segregate them for potential war crimes investigation. This created immediate tension. German soldiers attempted to remove or hide their SS insignia, knowing it marked them for special scrutiny. SS blood group tattoos, applied to all SS members for identification purposes, couldn't be hidden. American MPs checked prisoners' left arms for these telltale marks. Those identified as SS faced harder questions. Where had they served? What operations had they participated in? Had they been involved in actions against civilians or prisoners? Most claimed combat roles only, denying knowledge of atrocities. Some were telling the truth. Many were lying. Sorting out individual guilt from collective organisational criminality would occupy war crimes investigators for years after the war's end. The surrender of 10,000 SS troops raised questions at higher command levels. Should they be treated as ordinary prisoners of war or as members of a criminal organisation? Political pressures pushed toward harsh treatment. The concentration camps had just been liberated, revealing the full horror of the Holocaust. Public opinion demanded justice for Nazi crimes. But military necessity argued for following Geneva Convention rules to encourage other German units to surrender rather than fight to the death. The compromise was bureaucratic. All prisoners received basic Geneva Convention protections: food, shelter, medical care, and protection from violence. But SS personnel were marked in records for potential prosecution. Investigations would determine which individuals had participated in criminal acts. This satisfied both legal requirements and political demands for justice.